Good afternoon, everyone. We will begin in about a minute. I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to sign on. So we'll start in a minute. Welcome to today's program, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are joining us right now. We'll begin with introductions in a minute. I know more people will be joining us, but just to be respectful of everyone's time, good afternoon. Welcome to today's program. A little bit about how today is going to go. I'll introduce our moderator and our speaker. After our speaker presents, we'll have a short moderated discussion followed by Q&A. So please enter all your questions in the Q&A so our moderator can monitor them during the Q&A session. If this is your first time at our events, we welcome you and hope you sign up on our website to stay informed with our upcoming programs. Our speaker today is Collin Yarbrough. He is a Dallas native and current PhD student at the SMU Law School, Lyell School of Engineering. His civil engineering PhD is focused on transportation systems with a minor in economic geography and urban economics. His research focused in the intersection of racial and economic justice, infrastructure development, and community engagement. He has recently published a book, which he'll be talking about today, called Paved, Infrastructure Policy and Racism in the American City. Our moderator is Dr. Smith-Colin. Dr. Smith-Colin is assistant professor at SMU and seeks to advance sustainability and resilience goals through transportation, infrastructure, systems, research, education, and analysis. Collin, I'll now turn over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Bora. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank y'all for being here. See some familiar names in the chat. So thank y'all for showing up on a Tuesday afternoon, and we will go ahead and get started here. Share my screen real quick, and we will start the presentation. All right, so as Bora mentioned, the presentation today will be Paved a Way, Infrastructure Policy and Racism in an American City. And before we begin, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples and as traditional stewards of this land now known as Dallas and Texas, and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories here. It is important to understand the long existing history that has brought us to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation in that occupation. This is the land of the occupied, unceded, and stolen territory of the Caddo, Wichita, Kiowa, and Comanche, who stewarded this land for nearly 12,000 years since the Hassanai. These and other peoples experienced genocide and forced removal from the land now known as Texas. Their ancestors are present with us on this land and seek justice and healing for their people. We pay respects to their elders, both past and present. So some of you may be wondering who I am. My name is Collin Yarbrough. I grew up here in Dallas, not too far north of SMU. I went to undergrad in upstate New York, where I focused on engineering and management, and returned to Texas in 2012, where I spent the next 7 to 8 years of my career working in the natural gas business as a pipeline engineer for a local gas utility. My work involved building pipelines across the state, from dense urban contexts into in Irving, and all the way out into rural settings like West Texas. I'm a licensed professional engineer, and I left the natural gas business 2 years ago, and I'm currently, as Bora mentioned, a PhD student at Lyell, focusing on transportation and all kinds of inequality that exist in the built environment. But for today, my journey into this work began with this Friedman Cemetery, located at the intersection of Lemon and Central Expressway. While doing research for a paper on Central in one of my classes in the spring of 2020, I stumbled onto a 1990s New York Times article detailing how 1,157 bodies of people formerly enslaved were being dug up and moved to make space for the expansion of the highway to its present state. Many of these bodies were paved over during the original construction. And there was something so fundamentally wrong that we would prioritize the development of a highway over the eternal rest of Black bodies. And that research continued to lead me to other highways and neighborhoods of color in Dallas with similar stories of erasure and dismantling. And so today, I'll discuss some of the political and infrastructure mechanisms that play into how we got to today. And then we'll cover more of the history surrounding the neighborhood that used to surround these graves. So to discuss race in Dallas, we have to begin with understanding some of the political underpinnings shaping where we are today and the ways Dallas's white residents maintain control of political power. So most of that is done through elite white control. And in 1902, Texas saw the first statewide poll tax introduced, which was strongly opposed by not only people of color, but also populists and unions. And this served to undermine the ability for lower income people to participate in the election process and reserve voting rights for wealthier white people. And in 1903, another Texas state law allowed parties participating in elections to determine who could and could not vote in their primaries. And at the time, what was called the Southern Democratic Party had a near stronghold on Dallas's political system and called for a whites-only primary, which effectively eliminated the Black vote in Dallas. And at the early foundations of Dallas, it was based on a ward or an alderman system initially, which is kind of similar to the district model we have today, where representatives are elected based on their geographical area. And this shifted to an at-large commission in 1906, which was having, say, 8 or 9 representatives over the entire city of Dallas with no, specific geographical tie from a representational perspective. And so for many decades, local representation at many levels of government was informally controlled by white citizens councils and the Citizen Charter Association, both groups comprised of Dallas's white elites in an effort to attempt to stamp out dissent during the 1960s civil rights era. The first city council members of color were elected in 1969, albeit these were candidates that were largely approved by these white organizations. And it wasn't until after the hard-fought battles by Henry Martinez, Marvin Crenshaw, Roy Williams, Al Lipscomb, and Diane Ragsdale, and their coalitions of Black and Mexican American and Latin American communities in Dallas to have equitable representation on city council, that the at-large system was finally overturned in 1991. And this led to the 14-member district for councils that we have today. A system that's not perfect by any means, however, it's better than what we had. Now, the 1920s were a period of increasingly visible white supremacy in Dallas. The Klan gained significant power across all branches of government, from sheriffs to judges to the district attorney and even senators. And Dallas's desire to avoid dissent led to Klan popularity spreading throughout the city and was overwhelmingly supported by white Dallasites at the time. Pictured here is Dallas dentist Hiram Wesley Evans. And because Dallas was the largest Klan order in the country, Evans gained national attention and eventually became Grand Imperial Wizard of the Klan, leading the organization at a national level. And since we're a few days into the state fair now, it is only appropriate that we be sure to highlight the connection between the state fair and the Klan. This picture was taken on October 24th, 1923, which was Klan Day at the State Fair of Texas 98 years ago. Hundreds of thousands of attendees were present at the fair that day. And the ceremony drew around 75,000 people, which is enough to almost fill the seats at a Cowboys game at AT&T Stadium. And that day, Klan Order number 66, Dallas's Klan Order, gained 5,000 new members that day. But not all aspects of white supremacy are that visible. Sometimes they are less visible, but play out in a very large way. Things like redlining and segregation that are maybe a little more familiar terms. Now, early segregation efforts in Dallas were carried out through various formal and informal ways over the course of our history. This began in 1906 with the formal segregation of public places like schools, churches, public amusement venues. And Dallas was the first city in the state to attempt formal housing segregation in 1916, which was overturned by the courts the next year. And Dallas continued to innovate policy on housing segregation until something would stick. So finally, after several attempts in 1921, Dallas City Council passed a law allowing residents of a neighborhood to request their block being designated Black, white, or open, effectively creating an opt-in system of segregation. And changing the designation required a 3/4 vote by residents to change that racial designation. Dallas continually set precedent in the state for racial housing segregation. On an informal front, white Dallas residents notoriously sought to control segregation through violence and vigilantism. At least 3 prevalent attempts were made over the next 40 years in the 20s, 40s, and 50s, where bombings and threats were carried out on Black homes when attempting to move into marginal white neighborhoods or on the Black-white lines, until Jim Crow laws began to relax somewhat in the 1960s. And these visible elements of Dallas today are fundamentally shaped by historical context. They're shaped by what is sometimes referred to as the racial geography of our cities, the foundations which the built environment stands on. This is the invisible stage where politics and our lives play out. These homeowner loan corporation maps have resurfaced in the wake of popular books about housing segregation, like The Color of Law, which have brought a renewed interest in understanding the underpinnings of our cities, especially within the context of racial and economic exclusion. For a quick recap on the meanings, the colors red and yellow were considered hazardous for federally backed mortgages. These ratings generally in Dallas's context applied to Black, Mexican American, or Latin American neighborhoods or non-English speaking European immigrants. Blue and green areas were considered the most desirable from a mortgage lending perspective and were restricted to white neighborhoods only. So if we look at how this map has translated to present day Dallas, we can see that many of the outcomes from those 80-year-old policies reverberate into the racial and economic segregation in Dallas today. So this last map shows the present distribution of low income and people of color in the city of Dallas today. Areas with no shading are predominantly white and higher income. Yellow areas are above average low income. Blue areas are above average populations of people of color, and green are above average both low income and people of color. And our mechanisms of racially and economically segregating the built environment have shaped Dallas's residents of color for generations, with long-lasting effects from visible design like these loan maps, segregated neighborhoods, and food and infrastructure apartheid, while also being shaped by the invisible design of loan rates and access, land use burdens like concentrated air pollution, industrial zoning, and even political representation and districting. So the neighborhood we'll be using to contextualize some of this afternoon will be the North Dallas Friedmanstown neighborhood, which is now known as Uptown. The North Dallas neighborhood was generally bounded by McKinney and Pearl on the west and the north, Lemon and Haskell on the east, and Ross Avenue on the south. And kind of for a little extra context, the southeast edge ended where Clyde Warren Park begins today. Clyde Warren is actually located on what used to be the Little Mexico neighborhood just west of North Dallas. So from an infrastructure perspective, railroads were a hugely important part of Dallas's early development. The railroad pictured here, the Houston and Texas Central, rolled into Dallas in 1872, headed towards St. Louis, Missouri from Houston. And this was just a few years after the founding of the North Dallas Freedmen's Town, which it bisected. The railroad not only brought jobs, but also attracted workers to live near the railroad and concentrated development around the tracks in the area between what we now know today as Uptown and Deep Ellum. And this map from the African American Museum of Dallas shows the heavy concentration of businesses along Hall Street right before Central Expressway was built. Research from old phone books and other records show there were around 100 businesses on Hall Street alone. Today, there are a fraction of that many businesses. On the northwest side of Central, there's just a Walmart neighborhood market and a cleaners. And I want to emphasize how self-sustaining this and other neighborhoods of color were. As historian Dr. Mamie McKnight said, all the books talked about slum and squalor. Those of us who grew up in these neighborhoods knew better. They were viable communities paid for and built by Blacks. And while I won't spend a ton of time on that history in this presentation, it is important to understand what narratives are continually portrayed, who is portraying them, and who benefits from that portrayal. So North Dallas was full of incredibly successful businesses, ranging from taxi services, ice companies, all the way up to lawyers and doctors and grocery stores. For example, the Pinkston Clinic was founded by Dr. Lee Gresham Pinkston and was the only hospital in Dallas where Black doctors could practice before St. Paul's Hospital allowed it. Similarly, the McMillan Sanitarium was the only place Black surgeries could take place in Dallas. The State Theater was one of many Black theaters in North Dallas and not far from the plethora of theaters and clubs just southeast in Deep Ellum. And the Powell Hotel was built by D.H. Powell, and it boasted a 40-room capacity where anyone who was anyone would stay as they came through town. And I want to emphasize that North Dallas was the largest Black neighborhood in Dallas at the time. It was a hub. They had around 16,000 residents as of the 1940 census, which is right before a lot of the large-scale changes began in the neighborhood. And a lot of those changes came through policies. Policies like eminent domain, slum clearance, urban renewal, and even local land use and zoning influenced and continue to influence what is built, where it is built, and why it is built. Policies which control land use function as surrogates for maintaining and shaping systems of civic and political power. Eminent domain is the use of federal power to take over land for public use. It's a constitutional right, and in Dallas's context, was used to not only create highways through the middle of neighborhoods of color, but also to move people around so they were not present in areas making white people uncomfortable, like through building parking lots for the State Fair of Texas. In some instances, eminent domain functioned as a sorting mechanism, which disperses Dallas's Black and Mexican American neighbors from their homes. Slum clearance and urban renewal were federal programs to remove and improve what was called slum or blighted areas, most often used for the development of highways and public housing projects, which in North Dallas's context, took many landowners and made them renters. And in a country where owning land is a powerful factor in the political process, this can have massive ramifications for who controls shaping the built environment. Slums are created when infrastructure is underfunded, neighborhoods are overcrowded with people who have nowhere else to find housing due to formal or informal segregation, and then campaigns are created where you describe these areas in such a way that people fear them and think the only way to keep the disease from spreading is to cut it out like a cancer. Words are incredibly powerful, and racist ideology is the world's best at using it to promote white control over not only people, but space. And zoning is a more local approach to defining how land can be used. Not all cities have zoning ordinances. Houston doesn't, for example. But Dallas, like many other cities in the US, have developed zoning patterns where unwanted land uses are situated near low income or neighborhoods of color, burdening residents with not only loss of property value, but also the right to a healthy life, like having a 200,000 ton mountain of shingles in the middle of a Black and Mexican American neighborhood in South Dallas. And BIPOC neighborhoods across Dallas are still fighting these invisible design elements today through neighborhood associations standing up at city council meetings, city planning commission meetings, and influencing the future of their neighborhoods and our city with grassroots local-led community design. So to put some of this into visual context for what this looked like historically in North Dallas, the Roseland Homes Public Housing Project, which was built in 1942, in what residents described as the Highland Park of Black Dallas. Hundreds of homeowners were either forced out of North Dallas or became renters as a result of this slum clearance project. As preparations for construction of Central ensued a few years later, 1,500 residents lost homes in the winter of 1946 to make space for construction. Central Expressway also cut Hall Street in half and divided the neighborhood between east and west. It was a literal and figurative wall in the community. And as I mentioned earlier, Hall Street boasted over 100 businesses between Ross and State before the highway went in. After Central came through, businesses began to shutter and move out, along with the residents. And Central was heralded as a civic and infrastructure success, and it served the white suburbs, saving 5 to 15 minutes on their daily commute, all at the expense of the livelihoods and housing of Black residents in North Dallas. And I want to read this quote from Louis P. Head from the Dallas Morning News in 1925. This plan, which would be the Kessler Plan in 1911, would make Central one of the finest in the United States, and property now utilized for cheap industrial purposes or Negro residential districts would be changed into high-class apartment and retail business districts. And this prediction would come true almost 80 years after it was written, as North Dallas continued to be divided by highways and land development measures made the area attractive to real estate investors and the city of Dallas's vision for itself as a city moving into the future. So clearing for Woodall Rogers began in the late 1960s, and land sat vacant for over a decade before construction began in earnest in the late 1970s and 80s, which left a new barrier in the southern portion of the neighborhood, segregating institutions like Booker T. Washington, the Moreland YMCA, and large churches from the rest of the North Dallas neighborhood. The development of the Arts District and Uptown Public Improvement District in the 1990s began to change not only the names, but the faces in the area. And this is when the name Uptown came into being. And the Public Improvement District made millions of dollars available for redevelopment. Roseland Homes was also partially torn down and replaced with fewer units that would fit the aesthetic of the changing neighborhood. And this is a common pattern in Dallas's history and present, where there's this historic underinvestment in an area until it is somewhere the city of Dallas is interested in developing. And then policy mechanisms become available to facilitate development, often at the expense of existing residents. And this happened just west of North Dallas in the Little Mexico neighborhood. It's happening right now in the West Dallas Trinity Groves area. And it's happening in East Oak Cliff in the 10th Street Freedman's Towns and Black Bottom neighborhoods. And so while Dallas is incredibly well-versed in real estate investment and infrastructure development, White Dallas is now only just now becoming more well-versed in the ways these skills are so good at perpetuating systems of power in the built environment. And so while policies in place from the federal to local level shape how decisions may play out, it is ultimately the individual and collective decisions which will determine if we continue paving a way down this road or pave a new way to a just city? Thank you all. We will now open it up for some guided discussion with Dr. Smith-Colin.
Well, Collin, thanks so much for that presentation and for your ongoing inspiring work. So if there are those in the audience that have questions, we invite you to drop those questions in the Q&A, and I will ask those questions of Collin. So in the meantime, Collin, just to get us started, I'll start where you left off, which is to talk about the role of individuals. And so the question I have is, what can we do at the individual level play a part in shaping this for a more just future?
Yeah, I think half the battle is just knowing what's going on in our cities. I think probably the biggest gift from the research that I've done is I now know, growing up in North Dallas, I didn't necessarily have to know what else was going on in Dallas because the city basically works to serve my interests. So I didn't have to really put in a whole lot of effort to know much else about Dallas. And so now being plugged in with neighborhoods in East, South, and West Dallas, I have a much greater perspective of what is going on. And it's easier to see some of these patterns going on when you're plugged into some of the neighborhood groups or other associations. And sometimes it's just as simple as following Facebook pages of neighborhood associations and things like that. And when they have a call to action, many of them are mobilizing various meetings or things like that. And just keeping a pulse on what's going on, I think is one small step that individuals can easily take within kind of their current social media intake. It's, you can change some of the news that's coming in, and you can get a better sense for how neighborhoods of color might be facing some of these same patterns in the present day.
Great. And so how has your experience at SMU allowed you to explore some of these impacts, whether through research or coursework? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's funny. So I originally came to SMU as a seminary student. So I started down at Perkins. And because of the way SMU is structured, I had the flexibility to take classes all around campus, which is great. I like to dabble in a lot of different things. And sometimes that being able to have that flexibility, which SMU provides, it ultimately ended up leading to me shifting back into engineering out of theology, because I began to see how these pieces and dots that I've kind of collected over my life were beginning to synthesize. And I was starting to begin to understand how justice played out in the built environment, which was informed not only by my engineering education, but some of my human rights education I was getting and some of the theology education I was getting. And all of that came in under the Sustainability and Development Program out of the Hunt Institute in the Weill School of Engineering. And I think all of the ways that these pieces that exist and the people that are connected at SMU and the ways that people are willing to move around and encourage these kinds of conversations and this kind of research. I mean, that's ultimately what led me to your class this time last year, which kind of cemented my desire to continue this work. And it's just been a really encouraging and supportive process since then, moving into my current PhD work.
Great, thanks. So we have a question from the audience. How has the Dallas business community taken responsibility for improving some of these inequities, or what are some of the ongoing efforts that you've been able to participate in or observe that are trying to rectify these inequities?
I think one of the biggest things I've seen recently is there's a lot of work being done with the Real Estate Council and in partnership with Chase Bank and some other local partners to really work on doing concentrated work in some of the most marginalized in terms of concentrated poverty or other types of economic indicators, and then working with those neighborhoods and letting them lead decisions on how to rebuild and have their vision shape their future rather than having it be defined by outside entities necessarily. So I think we're beginning to see some of the emergence of kind of equitable economic development. There's one thing to kind of keep a pulse on. Earlier this year, the city of Dallas, under Dr. Eric Johnson, different from the mayor, is moving forward with a new economic development policy for the city. And most of that is focused on supporting business development in southern Dallas, south of I-30. So that is something to be watching. There's a lot of really good stuff in the framework. But the big thing will be making sure that, are we just talking the talk, or are we actually going to be walking the walk as we move forward and supporting development in a way that doesn't continue to push out residents from their neighborhoods in South Dallas.
Great. There have been a lot of interesting questions about resources, Collin. So let me just get that question out of the way. Are there any books or resources that you might recommend for the audience that they can dig into to learn specifically about infrastructure and systemic inequities?
Yeah. I mean, my book is a great one from a Dallas perspective.
Correct.
I would recommend that. But I would say Segregation by Design is a great book about infrastructure inequality and the ways that cities are segregated, services are underfunded, those kinds of things. And then I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but Clayton Nall is a researcher out in California and does a lot of work on specifically highway, the inequality caused by highways. He does a lot of research that was really beneficial to me from the Homeowners Loan Corporation perspective and understanding how I think 60 to 70% of those poorly graded neighborhoods are still segregated, low income and neighborhoods of color today, and what that means. So I think those are two good books. Obviously, The Color of Law is a great one to read as well. From a Dallas history perspective, just White Metropolis is a perennial read to understand racism in Dallas. And from a race and politics perspective in Dallas, The Accommodation by Jim Schutz was just re-released by Deep Vellum Publishing. It had been out of print for 40 years. So that's now available again if people are interested in that. So those are a couple of the books that I would recommend kind of on those fronts. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So a lot of the things I talked about were federal policy in nature. How have federal transportation policies and practices changed since we went through this massive highway building phase of the interstate highway system, and are things better now?
Right, so that's a great question. As far as the transportation domain is concerned, when we think about justice, historically, a lot of our efforts have been really balled up into the environmental justice movement, right? And some of that stemmed initially from President Clinton's executive order in the 1990s. And the focus there was that, ensure and fair participation. So there was a focus on participation. There was also a focus on mitigating disproportionate burdens. and then also preventing any denial. But what I'll say is that from that time, the focus was really more on health and environmental inequities. And that, I think, is really the umbrella that the transportation industry has moved forward with. By no means was that effort enough, right? And this is something that you emphasize a lot, Collin, that what happens at the federal level does not always trickle down in practice to the local level. And we know that. We know there's a real, but I think steps were taken at that point to try and correct that action through the environmental justice movement. But the fight continues, right? We see lots of everyday stories about burdens that are borne by minoritized communities, and those disproportionate burdens. Your presentation highlighted many of them. I think current day, the shift has been interesting. With the current administration, they came out pretty early with their focus on racial equity.
Yeah.
And that thread has trickled through many of the federal organizations, including the US Department of Transportation. What I found interesting is work that used to be done on transportation justice that was housed in the environmental wings of the DOT and transportation agencies. So things like the National Environmental Protection Act, that was really the only place that we had this concerted focus on impacts to underserved communities. The focus is shifting slowly. A lot of that work has now been moved over to the Civil Rights Office. For example, in Houston with I-45, with the interruption of that project, we saw that the letter came right from the Civil Rights Division of Federal Highway. And so we see that movement. And whereas before there was just this focus on environmental and health equity, we see very explicit focus from within the Department of Transportation on things like mobility justice, explicit focus on economic justice, and then of course, explicit focus on racial justice. These are executive orders, right? They're policy level efforts at the federal level, but that is the shift that's been seen. But I think your work highlights the importance of community level advocacy and local level work to ensure that those burdens are still not disproportionately borne.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially within the context, and I didn't go into too much detail about this, the eminent domain laws and the slum clearance laws were direct pipelines from the federal government to local governments to carry out these measures. So it didn't even involve the state. And so cities had kind of a blank check to say, yeah, this is a slum area. This is an area we need to clear out. And so, yeah, having that local control really mattered with those policies and still does in some of those cases. So yeah, that's a really good point.
So I have a question for you, and you brought this up towards the end of your presentation, but should we still be concerned about these types of infrastructure projects or patterns of development today? Are there neighborhoods that are still at risk? And is still
I go back and forth. Some days I feel optimistic, and some days I just want to bang my head against a wall because it just feels like we're repeating history. I think specifically from like a highway perspective, I think something to be watching within Dallas is the I-35 Deck Park here near the Dallas Zoo. And I briefly kind of mentioned the 10th Street district. It's one of the other Freedmen's towns that exists in Dallas. It's actually the largest intact Freedmen's town in the country. But it's quickly disappearing because the way some of the city of Dallas's demolition policies are structured. It's leading to a faster demolition in those historic districts of color where the homes are smaller. But there's this brand new deck park going in right next to it. And so residents who've been there for generations, since the 1920s and 30s, are very concerned about what that might mean. Seeing what happened with Clyde Warren Park over Woodall Rogers, there's a lot of concern that residents will see gentrification and development clustering around the deck park. That's what some of the residents in the neighborhood have told me when I've talked to them. And for a highway that came through and demolished their neighborhood once, cut through it in the middle in the 50s, there's work to hold an equitable development framework within this. And I think the team leading that is really trying hard to make sure that the residents are leading the effort. And I think that's making a big difference in the way that things are playing out. Residents feel heard, but there's still that skepticism. And so I don't know if that will go away. I don't think Dallas has proven that they can do that yet. And so until Dallas has a successful movement where residents aren't displaced and residents are allowed to stay and are included in the benefits that come from redevelopment, I think it's going to be very difficult. And I mentioned Trinity Groves, West Dallas, the La Bajada neighborhood, and others in West Dallas are still fighting industrial zoning and contamination, and also the gentrification coming from Trinity Groves, which is outside investment funneling in to the West Dallas neighborhood with no real effort or desire to be a part of that neighborhood. And I think those are kind of the two offhand that I can think of right now to be watching really closely. And then just Oak Cliff in general is really gentrifying at an alarming pace.
So given some of these patterns that you've observed, are there organizations that you are aware of that are devoted to the work that you mentioned, right? Just work within South Dallas or within our broader community?
Yeah, I would say for Southern Dallas, for sure, Southern Sector Rising is one to be watching. That was created by Marsha Jackson, who lived next to the Shingle Mountain that I was talking about. It's a coalition of Southern Dallas neighborhoods and organizations, and they're kind of the umbrella for a lot of that work. So following Southern Sector Rising is a really good place to see some of that information that's coming through and some of the efforts that are being led. West Dallas 1 is kind of similar to Southern Sector Rising in a lot of ways. It's a coalition group of West Dallas neighborhoods. And they're doing a lot of work right now, especially on an environmental justice front, but they're also working to try and figure out land use, zoning, and a lot of the things that are coming forward in the new comprehensive urban plan that's coming through. So those two organizations are really, really good ones to watch.
So there's a question in the Q&A, Collin, about civil engineering. So as a student of civil engineering currently, do you have any thoughts about how we balance infrastructure needs in terms of equity and ethics when we're making these decisions?
Oh, that's a tough question.
I'll let you give it a try and then I might weigh in.
I was gonna say, I think I'm still trying to figure that out. A lot of people are. Can you repeat that again? That was
sure.
A lot.
Yeah, so it's how would you balance the equalities versus infrastructure needs in terms of civil engineering ethics? For example, flooding downtowns of historic neighborhoods, right, to meet the broader needs of a community a la Houston, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and we actually see that in Dallas too, the Trinity River. Levees were designed in such a way that flooding occurs in South Dallas, but doesn't always flood closer to downtown and the business district there. That's a really tough question. I think ultimately it comes back to who is involved in the process. I think any notions of equity or justice hinge on the people who are at the table making the decisions. I think we got to this point because most of the people making decisions in the past and largely still in the present look a lot like me. A lot of the engineering and planning professionals and civil engineers, I think it's somewhere in the 60 to 70% are white and white males. And so there's a lot that comes with having that mindset. And engineering in itself is geared towards efficiency and maximizing things. And so to bring in notions of equity and justice, I think for a lot of engineers feels they kind of tense up and they're not really sure what to do with it because you can't easily define it and you don't have an equation for it. And that just makes engineers really uncomfortable. But I think fundamentally, if we are starting out having everyone at the table who might be impacted or involved in the process from the get-go, chances are good that we'll be able to head off a lot of the things. We'll be able to anticipate and sense stuff that's going on or may happen ahead of time. And then we can have those systems in place so that, we have the framework, we have the organizational structure in place so that if stuff comes in down the line, that either we expected or we didn't expect, there's a chance to gather everybody together and implement, a stopgap or some kind of solution to make sure that, unintended negative effects don't continue to worsen than they did.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, right? About who's at the decision-making table. I think even for students who are not participating in the decision-making process in their own work and in their engineering work, we emphasize, I think, both in the sustainability and development program, as well as my work and my courses, this idea of centering community impacts and people, right? And the decisions that we make about the built environment. So I think for those who are designers, operators of the built environment, and are struggling with these issues, I think that is one of the first and foremost principles, right? Not so much about what we design, but how will it impact those that we design it for, right? How will it be used?
Yeah.
I think this new, not new, but revitalized perspective that transportation is a civil right? Transportation is a right, and equitable access to that resource should be continue to hold as a budding engineer. And then I think some of the things that you've brought up is this, intersection, of course, between economic and social opportunity, right? And oftentimes, I think we've spent a lot of focus on impacts and opportunities of the environment. And now we see that there's growing interest and recognition in terms of those social and economic impacts. And I think for students who are engineers or infrastructure professionals, keeping that recognition at their forefront is important. And then some of the things that Collin continues to struggle with in his own work is how do we offer engineers and decision makers ways to appropriately measure these impacts, right? Even Federal Highway Administration is struggling with this. With us, in June of this year, they put out an entire request for information that was focused on collecting data about measures that are being used to capture equity impacts, about tools that are being used to assess inequity, and about methods. So I think for the engineering student or the built environment student, there's ways to contribute in that thinking, but also to recognize that there are many that continue to struggle with, how do we capture inequities? How do we measure them? And then how do we rectify them?
Yeah.
So Collin, you talked about this a little, but are there any other changes or signs that you've seen that are encouraging, right? Particularly as we move towards justice in the built environment.
From a Dallas perspective, I would say yes. I am encouraged, but cautious. Like I mentioned, the new economic development plan kind of proposed and adopted by the city council earlier this year shows a lot of new language and a lot of ways of including residents in South Dallas, of developing South Dallas in a way that feels different than the past. It's not policies that are going to funnel investment and what economists call this agglomeration, which is basically just like the, stuff being attracted to centers of activity, and trying to really develop things in a different way. So I'm encouraged by some of that. I'm encouraged by the way the city is looking at mobility and their plans around mobility and the current comprehensive land use plan that's underway. Like I said, again, the language is good. There are changes in people at the administrative level in the city who I think are really trying hard to center equity and justice in the work of the city, and resilience as a part of that. And that resilience comes through, not only climate change types efforts, but resilience is also an economic and a social factor for residents. Do they have the ability and the support networks? And I do see moments of that kind of blipping through from like a local government perspective. But I would say I saw a question about restorative justice in the chat and whether it's even possible in Dallas. And I don't know. I think there is so much privilege and wealth in this city that is so concentrated. As I talked about, a lot of the elite white control, some of that was in the past tense, but it is very much still in the present tense. A lot of the wealthiest and whitest people in Dallas still control a lot of what goes on. And I think I do have some reservations of whether or not we will be able to break through that status quo of privilege. But it is conversations like these, it is the renewed interest in people being willing to talk about these issues. I don't think I would have been able to have this conversation maybe a few years ago, or at least maybe not that many people would have shown up. They wouldn't have been interested. But I think in the wake of everything that fell out last year, for better or worse, there is at least a greater willingness to engage in the conversation. And that gives me hope. I get emails at least once or twice a week of people who are beginning to make these connections. Either they've read my own work or they've read other work, and they're beginning to see those patterns and they're beginning to see those things. And so when I see from an individual perspective, I'm beginning to see people change. I know those are small numbers in comparison to the millions of people that live in DFW. But I just have to continue holding on that enough of that will begin to make a difference and begin to shift, because that's what's ultimately shifted things for the city of Dallas. It has been concerted local neighborhood efforts, which have really pushed the city to make changes. And so I do see hope. I see hope in those efforts, and I see hope in the neighborhoods that are standing up and fighting because they are seeing change, and it's on their terms, which is great. That's a huge change.
Well, Collin, I was trying to decide if I wanted to ask you another question, but I just feel like that's the right point to end on. I just wanted to bring some attention. I think in the chat, when they asked about organizations, you had listed Southern Sector and Rising, as well as West One, as stations that are doing good work in Southern Dallas. I think we should probably just leave it there, but I want to say thank you, Collin, for your work, for your real interest in promoting these issues and moving towards just and equitable infrastructure, and the ongoing work that I know that you do with these neighborhoods and with these many community groups. I don't know how you find the time. We are excited to have you in our program and to have you lead us and work collaboratively with us as we tackle issues of infrastructure and justice. Paved Away was, I know, a labor of love for you and a labor and labor. I'm excited to see that that product of your work and your research has gotten such attention, and that you'll be able to continue the work from here on out.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for your leadership and continued willingness to engage in this, because you make it possible for the rest of us to engage in this work here at this university. And that's just something you can't even put words to how grateful myself and other students are to have faculty like you willing to support us in the work we're doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
And thank you both so much. We really appreciate this topic, and Collin, great presentation, and thank you to everyone who attended, and I hope y'all can attend more events that we have in the fall. So thank you both, and we hope to see you around soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.